Greetings all, and welcome to the second segment of A Traveler's Guide 2 for the Bottle Ship. And today, we'll be continuing with our look at the vessel with our next segment, A Traveler's Guide to the Biosphere. The Biosphere consisted of a massive greenhouse designed to simulate a vibrant environment for jungle and forest-dwelling creatures from a number of different plants, including zebus. With a waterfall, artificial rain, and countless tropical plants, it was a paradise for the natural world and could have easily been named one of the most beautiful sights in the galaxy, if not for the fact that the entire area, just as with other sectors, was completely artificial. The sky and backgrounds were all fake, designed to make the creatures inside the sector feel as much at home as possible. Moreover, while the sector was great for the creatures kept inside, they were all extremely aggressive and seemed to have no other desire other than killing the hunter for entering the habitats uninvited. The creatures of this part of the bottle ship might not have brought much in the way of extra hazards to bear, but Sector 1 was by far one of the most complex part of the facility as a result of the enemy variety there. It was also the only place where one could access the Bioweapon Research Center, where many of the station's more devastating bioweapons were initially planned and crafted. In the very back of the sector, there's also the Biosphere test area, which is designed to look like a clean grassy field with a beautiful blue sky and horizon being nothing more than a well-made hologram. This test area was further home to the exam center, a building that was likely used in conjunction with the test area to experiment with the inhabitants of the sector in a stable environment, and in particular, seems to have been the area where the lab workers on the ship tested the command and combat functions of the cyborg Zebesians and possibly even the super Zebesians. Lastly, it was here that the hunter was forced to terminate a Foon and Namahi and the subterranean control room in order to restore power to all the navigation boosts in the sector, as well as the King Key hunter, and fought against the mystery creature. Before we take a good look at the unique biota of this area, it's important to note that, as far as previously covered organisms go, this area was home to the bull, cyborg Zebesian, Gemer, Galmanian, Real, Radogian, Sighthopper, and Super Zebesian. Now then, let's start our examination of unique beasts that can be found in this lush, forested, and jungle-like zone. Wavers were unique insectoids named after the wave-like motions they made with their bodies as they floated in the air in search of food. These insectoids do not have any true limbs to speak of, the closest thing being the two shell-like structures that are attached to their bodies by strong connective tissue. These shell-like structures were filled with light gas to enable them to float without having to really fly, which worked great for them as they could not obtain much in the way of food otherwise as a result of their lack of limbs. Instead, these little monsters were hunter-scavengers and fed off the corpses left behind by larger predators, and as a result of their lifestyle, wavers were rarely found in large groups, preferring to scavenge alone to get their fair share of a meal. If food was scarce and they were on the brink of starving, however, wavers would not be afraid to attack in large groups in order to secure a quick meal for all, using their large mandibles to tear the flesh off soft prey. When not active, wavers would usually close their shell pieces around them to completely hide their bodies, ensuring they provoked as little attention as possible to potential predators. While they were content to simply live on their own and move around in a wavy pattern to increase the chances of coming across a random flying insect to snack on, though the true reason for this quirky movement pattern is still unknown, if they were threatened, wavers would close their shell halves and rotate their bodies rapidly before dive-bombing their target, hoping that the blow would at least deter the predator from further attack. This might not have worked in most cases, but it is interesting to note that they became invulnerable to damage from beam weaponry while executing this attack. Strangely enough, wavers were also some of the few creatures known originally from zebus that had distinguishable genders, as the color of the male's body is slightly different from that of the female. These entities didn't have much in the way of serious offense to deal with for most, but their armored forms could make them a bit tricky to handle without the aid of concussive firepower to wipe them out quickly, so they earn a nice spot within threat level beta. The skull terror was a small bony fish that was really much of an issue to deal with as a result of its benign nature, though this might not have always proven to be the case for stronger specimens. The skull terror was a little different from most types of fish in that it actually had two different life cycle stages that were designed for two completely different lifestyles. Normal skull terror had the appearance of medium-sized fish, possessing a fairly similar skeletal structure and organ systems. However, they were set apart from other types of fish because they actually did not have a scaly outer skin at all. Instead, the bodies of these creatures were coated with a thick layer of brown or purple material similar to hardened skin that gave them a rock-like appearance and granted them a surprising amount of resilience against direct attack, though they could still be eliminated with minor gunfire. Moreover, their entire body structure had a jointed form that made their bodily movements seem even more artificial than natural, despite the fact that they were living creatures. In this stage, these entities used their purple or brown color camouflage to blend in near the bottom of the ocean bodies they occupied while feeding on smaller fish and other creatures in the native habitat. They are normally non-aggressive in this state, but if present in schools, they might have tried to attack larger creatures in order to use the numbers game to score a free meal. These creatures had to be destroyed if encountered, as they would not start pursuing their target unless they died or got out of the water, and this aggression could make them a noble issue to explorers to deal with if they couldn't be put down with heavy weaponry, and turn securing them a solid footing within threat level beta. While the Foon and Namahi are often treated as completely different organisms as a result of their slightly differing anatomical forms, they're actually part of the same developmental line and are therefore worth describing together. These creatures were arthropods, whose heads were the only features normally seen, as they embedded the majority of their body space in a hard surface as soon as they were born. As these creatures grew, they slowly secreted an acidic enzyme from the back end of their body that helped to eat through solid rock and carve a space for the creatures as they grew in size. Eventually, they reached a point where the bodies would grow no more in terms of size. At this point, they could take one of two different paths. Normally, they would stop excreting acid and instead replace it with a sticky glue that fused the rock wall around them to their skin, forcing them to effectively eat and defecate through their mouths, but otherwise keeping them protected from extreme trauma, as their armored heads were very difficult to damage. On the other hand, it had been shown that these beasts may occasionally have chosen to slither out of the holes and become completely maneuverable. This behavior was especially demonstrated on the bottle ship, and while it did give these creatures the element of mobility, it also left the red, softer patches of skin on the undersides of their bodies open to direct attack and made it possible to deal a lethal strike to them. Regardless of the path they took, Foon were the adolescent stage of these creatures and were effectively locked into their current state for a span of several years. This could be a disadvantage for them as they had not developed any eyes yet, but they would actively still defend themselves by spitting orbs of blue hot fire that can scorch others from afar, even though they were unable to fight these projectiles very quickly. Though it is noted the specimens on the bottle ship had been bioengineered to fire electrical and not fiery projectiles. Despite the adolescent form, these monsters are normally impossible to hurt with anything other than super missiles, and thus can prove to be a noble obstacle to deal with and worth fitting into threat level beta. Namahi were the fully grown adult versions of these creatures and were readily differentiated by possessing a darker body color, the presence of functioning eyes, and the ability to spit projectiles at a faster pace than their adolescent form. These monsters were much more resilient against damage, though they could still be killed readily with a lethal strike, and so much so in fact that no form of conventional weaponry could actually hurt them outside of their general weak points. While these entities might be a much more active threat than the Foon, they are nonetheless still capable of being frozen and use as platforms as with the Foon, making it possible to scoop by them and get out of their way before they thaw and continue their assault, though this is not enough to elevate them beyond threat level beta. The members of the Key Hunter family represent a surprisingly intelligent race of insects that originally came to planets like Zebes from an unknown planet of origin, meaning that they may still be extant, unlike most other creatures that lived on Zebes. And while it may never be known exactly where they came from, their loyalty to the space pirates in the past nonetheless made them a serious threat. Key Hunters began their life primarily as Zeros, which were slug-like caterpillars that possessed a segmented body and few discernible features aside from eyes in some specimens. The natural body color could vary depending on the type of Key Hunter they would eventually grow into, but in most cases, they are fairly soft-bodied and could be killed with basic weaponry without much of a problem. The worst types of Zero that come into contact with were the brown variety, as while they might have had a similar body form than the others, they had eyes that were readily visible, and if they are not attacked with a weapon like a Morph Ball Bomb, Power Bomb, the Plasma Beam, or Screw Attack, they would instantly metamorphose into an adult Key Hunter within seconds of taking damage from other weapon systems. This is in stark contrast to the normal life cycle of these creatures, which usually takes a few hours to work once they start to enter a pupa state, and thus makes them a severe threat in many cases, although the otherwise defenseless nature makes it hard to rank them above threat level alpha. While adult Key Hunters could come in different forms, one specific type has only been observed on the bottle ship, although it may still likely exist in the wild somewhere. These creatures possess the same wasp-like body structure as other Key Hunters, but are a proper total of 6 legs and are known to have the ability to produce a sweet honey as a food source for themselves and especially their offspring, just like wasps on planet Earth. Though it is quite possible that all Key Hunters do this, and that it simply was not observed on Zebes due to an inability to study the Key Hunters there extensively. While they might not have been able to swipe at targets as viciously as other Key Hunters, they still retain the ability to spit balls of acid and could additionally grab onto targets in order to deliver their toxic payload right where it hurt them most. They also may have occasionally spit webbing from their mouths in order to entrap targets that prove to be too quick for them to easily hit from afar, or to otherwise set them up for a physical strike. The wings of these particular specimens could be blown off with strong firepower or an overblast, which could then leave them vulnerable to a lethal strike in close quarters, but they were far from helpless in this state. If they had to crawl along the ground, they would do so in an attempt to lash themselves onto the target that took away their wings, while violently detonating their bodies in the process to hopefully kill the attacker for the sake of the rest of the hive. These Key Hunters could usually be defeated with a few charged beam blasts, and were thus not a serious threat alone, but they generally tended to travel in large groups, and could therefore become a serious problem without weapons like the diffusion beam to hold them off. It is finally interesting to note that these creatures seem to share a symbiotic relationship with the whip vines in Sector 1 of the bottle ship, as they're often used to support structures for Key Hunter hives. It is uncertain if this was a common occurrence or was exclusive to the environment of the bottle ship, but the fact that the Key Hunters could help keep these plants safe from attack, while similarly being able to use their tenacious rooting structures for construction, seem to suggest that the two creatures may have found a permanently useful niche for one another, which may have proved to be of great interest from a bioweaponry perspective on the bottle ship had it all not devolved into ruin under MB's wrath. Regardless, these insectoids could prove to be a noble nuisance and irritant to deal with in large numbers, and have a fair placement within the confines of threat level beta. Super key hunters were an advanced variation of the key hunters observed on the bottle ship, and are believed to be an abnormal developmental stage that only that specific type of key hunter was able to enter after existing as an adult for some time, or even as a radical mutation as a zero, most likely triggered via bioengineering. These key hunters were a dark blue color contrast to the green color of their previous form, and possessed hardened crystals of some unknown organic material on their backs. Aside from the usual repertoire of attacks they had at their disposal, and increased resilience against damage, these monsters were also capable of directly attaching themselves to targets and sucking out their vital fluids in order to obtain energy, a vicious feat that was only made worse by the fact that they still tended to show the same swarm mentality as the key hunters they were designed off of. As such, they could be a far bigger threat to others that got in their way, and have a fairer placement within threat level Gamma. The King Key Hunter was a very abnormal member of the family, whose true biological purpose was still relatively unknown. Unlike its subjects, Key Hunters are stuck in a stage between being a zero and an actual key hunter, with a grub-like form, grey body and 6 tiny legs that were effectively useless for locomotion. In order to protect itself, the King Key Hunter secreted a strong web-like material from its abdomen as it grew that eventually spread out to form a massive nest for key hunters, oftentimes supported in the air by woody tendrils from mutated whip vines that could merely fire energetic projectiles at anything that got close to them when they opened up their flowers. These supports were essentially the lifeblood of this beast, for if all the supports were destroyed, the purple hive covering they used for protection would oftentimes fall over, revealing the King Key Hunter attached to the inside. At this point, key hunters would usually try to swarm in front of the beast to keep it protected from harm, but if crowds could be cleared out, the King Key Hunter could easily be killed with a few direct missile blasts. At the moment, it is uncertain exactly what role the King Key Hunter actually played in the society of key hunters, as it was eventually unable to defend itself in the slightest, and could readily be killed by its own kind if needed. It is possible that the King Key Hunter may in fact have been hermaphroditic, and only existed as a male in times of strife or conflict. This could have allowed it to reduce the energy it needed to consume regularly, and reduce the chance of it creating more zeros that only die shortly after birth, relieving them of a huge energy expenditure. On that same note though, it has been observed that the key hunters could reproduce on their own without the need of a King Key Hunter, suggesting that there may have been an equivalent Queen Key Hunter somewhere on the bottle ship. Without access to Galactic Federation records on the creatures living in the bottle ship to observe though, it is possible that the answer to this riddle may not be answered for some time, or at least not until the original home planet of their kind is located, but the creature nonetheless can only be placed within threat level Alpha for its inability to do much on its own to defend itself. The Waj and the Zuru were abnormal but structurally simple arthropods that resembled Earth trilobites a great deal, so much so in fact that they were more or less considered to be trilobites, even though they were not earthly in origin and had managed to far outlive their earthly relatives prior to the destruction of the bottle ship. The brown-colored Waj looked very much like a normal trilobite, with extensions on the edges of their cephalon and twin tail spines, but otherwise did not really have any fancy bells and whistles. The Zuru was known as being significantly different, as its yellow body possessed a fleshy layer on the front that glowed brightly. It is believed that they used this layer in order to attract small creatures to feed on in the underground tunnels they usually lived in. Both these creatures were exceptionally rare to see, as most were likely eaten by the rest of the crew after the outbreak on the bottle ship, but as they were completely harmless and could thus usually be ignored if one was not conscious about taking samples of them for further study, placing them within threat level Alpha. The whipvine was a fairly common plant form on the bottle ship that was generally only a serious threat when in close quarters or whenever the plant felt it was in danger. While the whipvine was not carnivorous in any real way, it had nonetheless developed an intelligence that made it much more difficult to deal with than most other traditional plants. When these creatures were not in an agitated state, their main flower was coated up in a bud form, and the plant was completely invulnerable to damage. Unlike other plants, the photosynthetic cells of these creatures covered not only the leaves, but also the outside of their petals, making it much more common to see them in this state even in bright light. However, if they detected a chemical aroma coming from an approaching life form they did not recognize as friendly, the flower would open up and channel stored solar energy to generate and fire energetic sparks at its target as a warning sign. These attacks were not that damaging and could usually be ignored, but if the approach continued, the whipvine would extend a long, semi-thick vine from its flower base and lash out with it in the immediate area. Getting hit by the vine may have only been mildly painful, but it could knock other creatures right out of the air and thus keep them from progressing, and if the plant was really feeling aggressive, it may have wrapped its vine around its target to release a massive current of electricity through the vine. This killed the vine in the process and forced the whipvine to rely only on its energy spark for defense, but it would still electrocute the target and leave it stunned and numb for a few moments. These plants were surprisingly durable when it came to beam weapons, but a single missile or charged plasma beam shot to the exposed flower was usually enough to take them down. It is fairly interesting to note these creatures seem to share a symbiotic relationship with the key hunters in Sector 1, as noted already, as they are often used as a support structure for key hunter hives. It is uncertain if this was a common occurrence or was exclusive to the environment of the bottle ship, but the fact that the key hunters could help keep these plants safe from attack, while simply being able to use the tenacious rooting structures for construction, seemed to suggest that the two creatures may have found a primarily useful niche for one another, which may have proven to be of great interest from a bioweaponry perspective if the bottle ship had not devolved into ruin under MB's wrath. Nonetheless though, they tend to be more of a nuisance than a serious threat to most, and are thus best classified within threat level Alpha. The gripper was an unusual bird-like animal that adapted to take the likeness of a plant in order to more easily secure prey in its environment. Living in tropical and muddy terrain, the gripper had the appearance of a large Venus flytrap on the ground, but this was merely a ruse. The moment that a life form passed by them that they thought they could eat, the monsters would leap out of the ground and clamp down on the target with their jaws, which are actually strong enough to hold most prey items in place for a long period of time, though dropping a morph ball bomb was usually enough to dislodge them once they start to bite down. These monsters generally preferred to use ambush tactics to fight, as they were unarmed and easily defeated with a few charged beam shots, and they had learned to take advantage of the large leaf-like limbs to do so. While they could use their limbs to stumble around on the surface when they were pursuing prey, they were better used underground, as they could tunnel exceptionally fast until they were right beneath their prey target, leaping up and clamping down without them even ever knowing what hit them. The mimicry skills of these monsters were impressive, and they could wait motionless for days at a time without so much as twitching, so it would be advised individuals kept their eyes out and weapons steady when traveling through the tropical areas these creatures resided within, as there was no easy way to tell the difference between them and an actual plant unless one could focus on the heat signature of the missile launcher targeting system, and are best classified within threat level Beta. The poison gripper was a subspecies of the normal gripper that was generally much smaller in size and much weaker, only needing a shot or two from a basic beam weapon to kill, and rarely ever spent its time waiting for prey to come to them, instead bringing themselves to their prey. These little beasts were of no consequence to creatures that are in possession of an armor suit for protection, but extreme caution was otherwise recommended. These fake plants might have been more direct in their attacks, but they had a reason for being so, as their mouths were coated with a lethally toxic substance that could easily be injected into soft tissue and would kill most within seconds of injection. Their smaller size and multicoloration might have made them seem pathetic, but wearing anything less than metal armor when near them was still a suicidal mission, best left to those that could actually take them out from afar, granting them a spot within threat level Beta.
Sometimes, even if an enemy seems like it would be a joke and really easy to handle, they can launch a nasty surprise at you that you likely might not see coming, and it can make all the difference in survival. Take these little buggers as an example. Sure, they're really weak, but they've got nasty toxins inside of them that can eat through armor and energy shielding too effectively. Being in the way of them without seeing them coming can be a hell of a pain if you don't have an easy way to cure their noxious attacks. Thankfully, their armor of God is protected against that kind of crowd, so come at me, I say. Let's see you get past this impressive like a space pirate stud hood.
The Cryptions were mammal-like arthropods that shared much in common biologically with creatures like the armadillo, especially in regards to their facial features, and possessed many of the same basic defensive attributes. These creatures possess elongated claws that are perfect for both ripping apart prey and digging, as their curved shape made them useful as shovels when the creatures burrowed through the ground. Their tails may have made them look a bit cute from afar, but these monsters had been made far from cute as a result of the experimentations that had been conducted on them, though in their current state this is only apparent in looking at the spines that are growing abnormally on the edges of their arms. The Cryption's back was covered in thick, flexible armor that kept them protected against most types of attack, especially when they were rolled up, and thus serves their primary means of defense. Whenever a Cryption spotted a prey item from afar, they would roll their bodies into a ball and fling themselves down slopes towards the target in an attempt to ram into them and crush their bones. In this state, they were effectively invulnerable to damage, but they could be forced out of their curled form with a charged beam shot or concussive weapon like a missile or morph ball bomb. Once they uncurled their bodies, the Cryption relied on swiping and leaping attacks with his claws in order to inflict trauma against his target, but can be dodged to set up a lethal strike. And if it felt that it needed to escape, it could burrow into the ground and roam around for a bit before rocketing out of the surface as a ball and repeating their attack pattern again. These beasts could take a while to defeat since they could only be hurt when they were uncurled, unless they could be forced to stumble backwards with a charged beam shot to set up an overblast that would knock them over and render them vulnerable to a lethal strike. But they are not that powerful in general and can easily be defeated with a few well-aimed charged shots or a missile. It is noted though that in this stage Cryptions were actually fairly benign, so while they might have been dangerous beasts to fight when they were hungry, they would usually leave other life forms alone otherwise and could be surprisingly friendly, giving them a nice settling point within threat level Beta. The mighty Cryption on the other hand was a force to be reckoned with on any occasion. These monsters share the same basic anatomy as normal Griptions, but existed as a mutated adult state induced by genetic tampering from the Galactic Federation. In this form, the claws in these monsters grew even longer, and the spines of their arms spread even further, severely cutting their arms and legs and causing both a massive extension of their shoulder armor into a pair of curved wing forms, which they can flap to hover briefly in the air when jumping, and a series of enormous curved spines to grow from their back shells, turning them into living saw blades when they curled up their bodies. In addition, their bodies were a darker shade of green, and the head shape was rather more reptilian than mammalian in form, with the gem-like marking of the head changing color from yellow to blood red, further accompanied by an increase in fang size. Most importantly of all, however, these monsters were extremely aggressive and would kill anything and everything in sight, making them potent bioweapons for any experienced explorer to face, given the powers that they shared with their normal relatives. Despite these new looks and increased offensive power, however, the mighty Gription essentially behaved identically to the normal Gription and could thus be taken out in the same manner, though a bit more precision would be needed to ensure avoidance of their rolling attacks, unless they skewer an unprepared individual and cut them in half before they can even react, placing them firmly within threat level Gamma.
Damn, I'd say these ones won't cross it anyway in any circumstances. They just want to roll up and dig around, popping up beneath it like a freaking weasel or something. Tends to get you off guard and you're not prepared to handle it in any way. Sure, maybe you can still get a drop on them with a powerful enough weapon, but that doesn't mean you'll be left in all cases. Kinda funny to see how the mutates are growing and stronger. The hell don't look like they do. I don't want to judge for all those spines and rock out me think of a goose ball or something. Reminds me, you get one of them sometime. They're usually pretty popular here.
The Grogant was a massive herbivorous lifeform that tended to live in forested environments where it could eat and hide in peace, though it was not unheard of for them to venture out into colder environments if they were desperate for food. The Grogant was a unique animal that had developed a bark-like skin on its entire form that allowed it to resemble a tree of some sort and effectively blend in with its natural surroundings, making it very difficult to discern it from just another large plant. The Grogant likely adapted this form as protection against predators on its home planet, but what kind of predator that was remains to be seen, as no data has ever been released on the creature's planet of origin to the public by the Galactic Federation. The Grogants would generally feed on fruits and berries for sustenance, as well as large quantities of leaves, using their long necks to reach the tops of tall trees, while their bill-like mouthparts were perfect for cropping large mounds of leaves in a single bite. The Grogants generally remained benign towards other life forms in most cases, but if it was awakened while in the middle of a nap, or if its local environment was disturbed in any way, it would reveal itself and try to take out the threat personally. Getting stuck beneath one of these creatures was a bad idea, as they could easily knock over other targets with their long necks and stomp them into the ground with their 6 spidery legs. When not immediately beneath them or near them on the ground, the Grogants would fire large purple seed pods at their enemies as a projectile attack. These pods were launched either automatically or in pairs every time the Grogant reared up its legs and stomped the ground, and while they might have been colorful, they should have been shot down quickly, as the explosion they created when they impacted something, due to a shock vulnerable chemical that coated the outside of the structure, could be quite damaging. Oddly enough though, this one was actually a defensive measure the Grogants used all the time, as its delicate offspring seeds tend to be quite tasty to other creatures, so coating these seed pods in this explosive substance helped to deter further attacks and thus allow these creatures to more successfully propagate and maintain a stable population. The only weak part on the body of the Grogant was a large semi-gelatinous structure on the underside that actually served as a primary photosynthesizing organ. It is highly unusual for an animal to be capable of possessing such a functional structure, but it seems that the Grogant's long-standing use of plant features as a disguise had translated into making them plant-like in many respects, the ability to gather some minor energy from sunlight being one of them. The existence of this organ also explains why Grogants slept with their pod facing down, as they could put themselves in a semi-serious state of stasis when the organ was unable to directly feed off of light from above, making their appearance as a plant all the more convincing. The transparent lining that covered the photosynthesizing organ was vulnerable to all types of attack, so charged beam shots and missiles were one's best friend if forced to fight one of these creatures. However, it is noted that if the Grogants took considerable damage and accidentally flipped over as it tried to rear up on its legs, the joints in its legs and neck could be completely rotated, allowing them to go from taking on a spider-like shape to a more sauropod-like form, with the photosynthesizing organ exposed on the top instead of the bottom. The monster became somewhat slower in this state, but was also able to make better use of its spore paws to deal damage, as its target would be firing at the top of its form, and thus in the pathway of the Grogant's projectiles. The Grogant was a fairly benign creature in most cases, and generally should not have been a problem to sneak around, but if fighting one was not optional, a steady aim and patience were highly recommended, as the Grogant was capable of taking a lot of damage and can more than fight back if they felt that their life was in danger, landing them squarely within threat level Beta. The Dragonix was an extremely bizarre and fascinating creature that could easily make itself a threat to anyone that couldn't figure out which side to attack first. Currently, it's not known if the Dragonix was actually ever altered from its original state to make it a better bioweapon, but this seems unlikely as the creature's effective natural attacks and behavior already make it a serious menace to look out for. Most of the time, the Dragonics was actually a benign beast and could be very difficult to wake up from a nap, which they usually took on a constant basis in order to conserve energy, as they were used to living in environments that are otherwise devoid of large prey items to hunt. Strangely enough, though it might seem contrary to basic logic, this monster technically only had one head, but did possess two separate mouths. The main head, which is actually quite small relative to the rest of the body, was adorned with a pair of antenna-like extensions that helped them read the chemical vapors in the air and thus detect prey that may have been nearby, as the eyesight usually wasn't too good. Conventional wisdom would say the digestive system of this monster was connected to this head, but in truth, the only thing the main head was connected to was their lungs and a potent flame sac that allowed these monsters to breathe out intense streams of blue fire. Once they felt they have stunned or at least killed their prey item with this attack, providing they are facing their prey item initially, the Dragonics would usually turn around on a single pair of lumbering legs and open up its darker colored tail, revealing a massive tooth-filled maw that could shred flesh and crush bone in seconds before swallowing it and transporting it to the creature's actual digestive system. This bizarre hunting tactic actually seemed to work for the Dragonics and made it a top predator in the lands it originated from, but it is known that an explosive like a morph ball bomb could be enough to make them spit out a potential prey item. The hide of the Dragonics was quite thick and essentially impervious to damage, but the large orbital fleshy material that hung from the abdomen, which is actually the egg sac and was present in all specimens of the species because they're hermaphroditic, was highly vulnerable to attack. A trio of missiles could be used to kill them in short order, but if forced to approach the monster from its dangerous back end, a charged plasma weapon like the Ice Beam could be used to freeze its massive jaws in place, setting the creature up for a point-blank lethal strike to its underside. Even if they could be corralled into revealing some openings in their attack patterns, these beasts could still prove to be a terrible surprise for those not prepared to deal with both ends of their forms, and land a solid place within threat level beta.
You know, I once heard these strange creatures were the focus of a two-headed cult in their home world, or so legends would speak of. It was seen as a trickster deity of sorts to those that came across it, a monster you can never trust because either head could deliver a terrible fate, either cursing you with its screeches or swallowing you whole for daring to violate its personal space. It's almost a little silly to think of these beasts as deities, but you would be surprised what sorts of cultures can spring up around monsters of legend. Though in this case, it's clear that technology wasn't their strong suit, given that the beast was somewhat easy to dispatch, and we don't have translators to hear its end of the tale. How sad.
The FG-1000 was a security robot designed to protect the Biosphere from intruders using a variety of weapons. The FG-1000 itself is a small sentry with two thin extendable wings jutting out of the main head where the machine's visual sensors were located, a thin drill-like lower body and a defensive energy cannon attached about midway to the bottom tip of its body. The sentry did not really use its wings for true flight, instead relying on the electromagnetic generators inside of its body to help it levitate off of the artificial gravity that existed in the bottle ship, and could thus fly anywhere they really wished to, oftentimes keeping themselves on the outside of a platform or pathway in order to stay as far away from direct contact with the bottle ship's large denizens as possible. The FG-1000 was equipped with two basic types of weapons. They either possessed a basic energy cannon that allowed them to fire thick but slow-moving lasers at a target, or, when greater security was called for, could exchange energy between two units with wave beam technology to create an energy barrier between said units. Their barriers could often be jumped over or rolled under, but the machines themselves could not be destroyed with wave beam shots, instead requiring a shot from a plasma beam in order to be destroyed. The FG-1000 were decent security robots that could perform their main task adequately against many of the smaller monsters in the bottle ship, but defensively they were still quite weak and could be easily eliminated with a few shots from any basic beam weapon under most circumstances, landing them in place within threat level beta. The FG-2 Ground was a security robot designed for use in the bottle ship for the sole purpose of guarding important areas and pieces of equipment that are meant for only authorized personnel to access. These robots had a unique body form consisting of a main gun unit with a visual sensor and cooling fan on the top, and a series of antennae on the top of the cooling fan for remote communication, while the lower end of the machine contained a small bent structure that faced towards the front of the gun and serves as an electromagnetic drive that allowed these machines to hover in the air indefinitely and could be adjusted in order to make the most of the artificial gravity that may or may not have been placed in a given area. The FG-2 Graham was mainly designed as a deterrent and not a killing machine, and thus did not react much to the local bioforms aboard the bottle ship. But they did treat humans as enemies and seemed to be unable to differentiate a hostile target from a safe one when they had no mainframe to transfer real-time data to, which may explain why they all went off protocol after the bottle ship was torn apart by the forces of MB. This machine would generally resort to using ramming attacks to deter most minor threats, pulling back just a little bit before forcefully rocketing forward to push back and knock over larger creatures. If this is not enough to deter their opponent, the machine would open up its front gun and begin to charge up an energy blast that can deal considerable damage if it managed to hit anything. This is also, however, the only time the machine was usually vulnerable to attack, as the rest of his body was heavily armored, and the gun cannon was the only port that exposed the electronic infrastructure to direct attack when charging, plus a successful shot had a chance of stunning the machine and causing it to misfire. It is noted though that weapons like the wave and plasma beams could pass right through the armored bodies of these machines, making them much more easier to destroy, as one do not have to wait for them to open their gun ports in order to be hurt. Some models of this machine also had access to a powerful electromagnetic energy cannon that could enable them to fire streams of electricity at targets, which would function just like the wave beam and thus pass right through some objects. The FG-2 Graham was among the best security robots that the Federation had access to at the time of their creation, and still served as an important tool of defense on research stations across the cosmos. And the fact that they always travel in groups could more than make them a nuisance to most, even though they may not have been the smartest of robots without a mainframe to retrieve combat data from, giving them a solid place within threat level beta.
After a lot of time working on small intelligent robots and shit, I have to admit that for a security robot, this thing is actually really well made. The armor on its form is pretty resistant against standard gunfire, and only really bypassed by weapon systems that most wouldn't have access to. And the weapon systems on the drones themselves were pretty strong and honestly pretty well designed, even if its best offensive attacks are also what would put them in the largest realm of danger. The variable weapon systems were a touch of genius too. Good to see different weapon systems used for different needed purposes. All in all, the Graham was actually pretty damn solid as a whole, which is why I'm going to see if I can sneak into the Federation's online archives and try and steal its design plans for my own use.
The Dysbrachian was a vile beast that was very hard to come by even within the hallways and rooms of the bottle ship, but for most, that was a very good thing, as these monsters were incredibly powerful and difficult to kill. The Dysbrachian was a large insectoid creature about the size of a fully grown human, with a large stout thorax and a very small abdomen, with one pair of sturdy legs and two pairs of arms tipped with massive razor-sharp claws capable of piercing metal without any trouble. The creature possessed a tight cluster of 7 eyes, 5 of which were very large and were used primarily for sensitive motion tracking, while the 2 small eyes acted to correct for depth perception issues to give them the best of both visual perspectives. In addition, these creatures possessed wings that were incredibly beautiful and had the appearance of stained glass, which went really well with their purple body coloration, but these wings were more for distraction than anything else, as the creature was genuinely too heavy to fly. This is because they had been bioengineered to produce a series of organic metal plates on the backs of their shells as a form of defense. Most of the time, these creatures would remain dormant inside of special sockets in some parts of the bottle ship, and acted to block off access to some areas for the sake of protecting valuable items and other treasures. While in stasis, these creatures look merely like domed objects inserted into a wall and are completely impossible to damage, let alone remove normal weaponry, but the intense energy released from a power bomb was usually enough to make them wake from the slumber and aggravate them into attacking at full force. These creatures did not have a lot going for them in terms of attack variety, but that didn't matter much in close quarters, as these beasts could slice, stab, and pound the ground near them with their massive clawed appendages in order to deal immense amounts of damage against even the sturdiest of armor systems. Moreover, these beasts could only be attacked from the front, as the steel carapace that covered their back could deflect beam shots and even missiles right back at their attacker. The front was not that much better though, as Dysbrachians required at least 3 super missiles in order to kill, more than practically any other creature aboard the bottle ship. Moreover, if these insectoids became heavily damaged, they can close up their shells and enter a regenerative state, where they resembled a large glowing green pill that was impenetrable to attack from anything aside from a power bomb, and even then would not hurt the creature but merely force it out of stasis, before bursting out with most of the damage inflicted on them completely removed. This can make a fight with one of these monsters incredibly difficult and long, but if they could be stunned with a series of rapid-fire charged beam shots, it was possible to rush to them and deliver a charged beam shot directly to their face in a lethal strike. This opportunity would not last long, however, and it may have been safer to just try and destroy them from afar, as Dysbrachians were so nimble on their feet and erratic in their movements that risking a counterattack was usually not worth it unless one wanted to get close to their bodies and risk being reduced to mere shreds by the elite soldiers of MB's bioweapon forces, rendering them a perfect fit for threat level Delta.
Nope, just no, not all. Oh freaking hell no. You see this shit? I don't know from anything but a powerbomb just wakes these buggers up and doesn't even really hurt them? Screw that shit, I don't think so. Try to put up my dukes in the simulation against one of these things, and I don't think I even tire them out a bit. Seriously, these buggers require insane firepower to take down, far more so than almost anything I've personally ever seen before outside simulations and shit. You couldn't pay me enough to even think about going near these things in real life. Honestly, I don't even know if it's really the Federation that made them, or if it was MB as a personal project. Either way, if you see one of these things, I have one request for your sakes. Get the fuck out of there!
The Biosphere was a lush and truly vibrant location that more than simulated the sort of exotic natural landscape you would imagine for a land designed to house creatures used to forests and jungles as their primary habitat. However, in saying this, it wasn't always a great picnic for others that wished to explore the location, as while the beasts that occupied the area might not always have been the most dangerous, they could still prove to be a pain for explorers to handle without the sufficient firepower needed to put them down, and even to a little degree in some cases. While fire could easily help to burn away the inhabitants of this location, and in turn make it a unique place to dilly-dally around at, the creatures here nonetheless had more than a few ways to handle that sort of issue, and thus could be a massive problem to deal with. Still, if you were looking for a lovely exotic land to spend your time in, this could have been a great observation point for explorers that merely wished to observe the wildlife from a distance. This tropical paradise more than lived up to its namesake of being a place for exotic creatures, but even then, a lot of them could be seen as common fare in the grassy lands that define a peaceful life for many. Don't get too comfortable though, as we are just beginning, and our next stop is going to take the temperature way down, as we next explore the freezing zone of the ball ship simply known as Sector 2, the Cryosphere. Thank you all for watching this video. We here at Space Pirate Science Team take our work very seriously, and we genuinely wish to be as informative as possible when it comes to the work we conduct here, for both ourselves and in the name of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment to help us get greater recognition out there to inform the greater populace of the universe as a whole. Also, feel free to keep track of us through Twitter, as we'll be posting notices there every time something new is submitted for your viewing pleasure. We hope to see you all in the next video, no matter what world it may take us to.